Well, I'm now preparing to put the epoxy on. I've looked everything over several times, make sure it all looked right. And I've got my epoxy mixing over here. Applying the epoxy over your finished wrap is the part that keeps more people from going into rod wrapping as a hobby or as a business. It's real easy to put just a ton of work into this and then get right to this point and make a mistake. So the first thing you're going to do is be absolutely certain you've got equal parts of your mixture of epoxy. Part A and part B. And then when you're mixing it, you're going to be very careful not to mix it too fast, because if you mix it too fast, you're going to introduce an awful lot of bubbles in it. Bubbles are the problem. It's difficult to keep them from getting in there when you mix it. It's even harder to get them out if you get them a bunch of bubbles in your epoxy. And after hand mixing it for years, someone come out with that handy little mixer you saw me using a while ago, and I think it turns 18 RPMs, and there's a certain little cup that fits in it, and it makes mixing it a lot easier. I'll generally let it mix for 3 or 4 minutes, and I actually set a stopwatch when I start doing this. Different manufacturers of epoxy or finish coat dry at different speeds. Now I'm using Flex Coat today. It tends to set up a little quicker, which is both good and bad. The good part is it sets up quicker. The bad part is when you're getting your epoxy on everything, you have less time to work with. But for me, it seems like the Flex Coat gives a much more durable finish than other brands. And as I said before, I don't have any sponsors. No one gives me money to say I like their stuff. I've used different brands over the years, and the Flex Coat seems to give me the best job. Now when you're putting your epoxy on your decorative wrap, I just use a little standard tongue depressor that comes from hobby shops or from rod building supplies places. Once I get to the guides where I need to be a lot more precise about putting it on, then I'm just going to use the hard end of a little hobby brush. So for this first coat over the decorative wrap, I'm going to slop it on here as thick as I can without introducing air bubbles. And air bubbles are a problem. If air bubbles dry in your epoxy, they really look bad. And so you're making it a point to control how many bubbles, and you are going to make some bubbles, but the more bubbles you make, the harder you make it on yourself, because by the time it gets done, you need to have all the air bubbles popped out of it. Now, a lot of people use a little alcohol lamp, and I've even seen people use a cigarette lighter. I use my propane torch. Turn the flame down real low, don't get too close. And for me, it seems to work better. It's very easy to control where you're putting your fire, and you can turn that torch into any position, and it's just easy to work with for me. But if you do choose to use a propane torch, be careful not to burn your house down. Generally, that kind of thing doesn't make the spouse happy. So I've just almost got my initial decorative wrap completely covered up with epoxy. So I'm going to stop at this point and go back and make sure I don't have any air bubbles. Now, there will be air trapped in your decorative wrap, and if you did a name weave, there'll be air trapped in that name weave, and that air will come out while your wrap is spinning and drying. This is my original Pac Bay rod wrapping machine, and it had on it the ability to dry your rod and the ability to turn your guides, both. Now, I don't think I'm going to be able to get the torch up close enough to show, or I mean the camera up close enough to show air bubbles, but I'll make an attempt and then I'll start popping air bubbles. And you can see air bubbles coming around there. And it's very common to have the air bubbles want to develop where you did a name weave. And this one is doing exactly what's very common. Now I'm going to turn this torch down as low as I can keep it turned down and have it not go out. And I'm going to move very slowly across my epoxy, because if you get this stuff too hot, it will boil. And if you boil it on there, then you really have a bubble mess to contend with. Also, if you get it too close to the cork, it will discolor the cork. And if you have an area that has a bunch of bubbles at once, kind of localized at one spot, you can't pop them all at the same time. You'll get your epoxy too hot, and again, it'll boil. So while the rod is spinning, you're popping the bubbles at different areas. And those bubbles are going to come up just because as you put it on, there'll be air trapped in your thread, and just air bubbles work out. If I wind up having too much epoxy drip off while I'm working on it, I'll add more epoxy to the wrap. And when you add heat by popping these air bubbles, this epoxy will get thinner, and it'll drip off much easier off of your rod. And I have had air bubbles come up as much as 30 minutes after I started. So once you start putting epoxy on here, you are here, babysitting your rod for a while. I actually had a moth light on it one time while it was spinning, and I'd already figured I was done. I had all my air bubbles gone and had left the room. And that moth lit on there and made one heck of a mess. While it was fluttering trying to get loose or free, he just kept making a mess out of my epoxy. And then he dried on there. Which none of that just really thrilled me. So now, once I start putting epoxy on, and this is just what I do, anyone else can handle that however they want, but I don't get too far away. I'm going to stay here and watch it until it becomes tacky. And just like using that expanding glue, this is going to be several hours of turning on here. So once I get all done with this, I'm going to fiddle with something else, or put a movie on, or do a little studying on something or another. Just something to occupy me while I'm watching it. And if you can see, I've got a little kind of a heavy spot of epoxy right here. It hangs down further. As it turns, it'll generally seek its own level. But then when you hit it with the heat, it'll get thin and hang down, and you can just take the end of your little hobby brush and you can straighten it right out. And I think I mentioned before, but in case I didn't, once you put epoxy on there, that epoxy works like a magnifying glass. And any mistake you have on there, it will magnify that mistake and it'll look worse. Now, as the person that built the rod, you'll notice the mistakes, if you have any, a lot easier than anyone else that didn't build the rod. If you make a mistake, I wouldn't be pointing it out to people, because no one will ever know. There we go. Now let me look that over pretty good. And it seems to be looking all right. I have a couple bubbles right here where my blue thread starts. Now, for the people out there that have built a lot of rods, they're very used to doing this, and it's just nothing to them. But if you're working on your first rod, just really be careful, whether you're using an alcohol lamp or whatever you choose to use to get your flame. You want to be careful not burn anything down, because you are working with a flame. Now, one thing I do just to keep stuff neat, when I start, I keep me a Q-tip handy and my bottle of alcohol, in case I get a little epoxy somewhere where I don't want it, and I can wipe it up. And on my winding check, I'm going to touch my Q-tip with that and make sure I have a clean edge all the way around that winding check, so that it's not coming up and off on one spot and not enough on there on another. I like everything nice and clean. There's a couple more little bubbles have come up on my name. So I've got my epoxy applied and the bubbles popped pretty much on the decorative wrap. And now I'm going to start putting it on my guides and such. And it's taken me 22 minutes since I started the epoxy mixing. So now I'm going to scoot on down and put some more epoxy on. Now I'm not sure if it shows up on camera, but the label to the rod is right here. And experience has taught me that that label will come off of there sometimes. The glue on the label will get weak from being in the heat and the cold and this and that. And so I've just started putting me a coat of epoxy over that label. And that's going to protect that label for now on. Now when you pop your bubbles off of your label, be real careful because heat will make any label, the glue on the label, get loose. That's why people use a heat gun to get stickers off their bumper. They buy a used car, has a bunch of bumper stickers on it. You get out there with a hairdryer or a heat gun and heat them labels up and they'll peel right off. Well, the only problem is you're going to have epoxy on this and you don't want it peeling. Okay, so as you can see, I've got my epoxy on all my guides. And if I had not put this little piece of glow-in-the-dark thread out on the tip, I would have matched my green and copper. There'd have been a band of copper and a single band of green out here on the end just to make it all match. And if it had been a two-piece rod on the female end of the ferrule, I'd have put a little green and a little copper band to match my guides. And if I was using another color, I'd do whatever the guides were, I would have matched that. And that those two bands of thread around the ferrule greatly strengthens that ferrule. So on a two-piece rod, they will usually fail at the ferrule, and that generally solves that ferrule problem. Well, as you can see, my rod is done. Kind of roll my decorative wrap around a little bit. And if you remember, I told you that the finish epoxy is going to magnify everything, so any little mistake looks bigger. Now you can see my hook keeper here. You might see that I have just a little bit of epoxy on that hook keeper, and that's going to clean right off. And I think I am liking that 10-inch red thread. And as you look down the rod, you can see my guides as they spiral around the rod, and I don't have the rod on the 0 axis. There we go. And as we get out here on the end, you can see there on the bottom, get my shadow out of the picture, right on down to my glow-in-the-dark thread on the end. Epoxy's all the way dry. And this rod came out pretty good. Now it's not as the action is not as slow as I'd like it to be, but it is what it is. And this is why when you use a new manufacturer's blank, you make one for yourself to check it out. Now this one is going to be plenty sensitive enough for me to be able to crappie fish with it. So I'll use it for casting spinners or crappie crankbaits, or when I'm fishing really deep water and I have a 1/4 ounce spoon on the bottom of it, and it'll be plenty sensitive enough for me to feel it. Now, as you recall, I put a lot of effort into gluing on this reel seat with the expanding glue. And I don't know if I ever come out and said it, but once you've glued that reel seat on, the way I do it, there's no mistake you can make, short of breaking the rod in half, that'll keep that rod from being just extremely sensitive. So this is it, one project start to finish.